Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be. Thank you for joining us for our panel on tech governance in the age of the cloud. We're holding this panel to mark the launch of our web-based tool that highlights the diverse governance challenges that come to a head in the cloud, as cloud services presently constitute the apex of the digital transformation and likely to be that way for some time to come. This new tool that we're unveiling today aims to highlight in a very specially user-friendly form, the huge diversity, complexity, and interdependence of the issues that play out in the cloud, from security, robustness, resiliency, through consumer protection, sustainability, and inclusion, all the way to human and civil rights. And to portray these issues from the perspectives of providers, users, governments, and communities. Admittedly, many of the issues that we're going to take up today have preceded the ascendancy of the cloud, but nevertheless rank prominently therein because of the cloud's ubiquity, centrality, and the level of our dependence on these services. Some other challenges, though, with the clouds are new or at least more acute, inherent, for example, in the oligopolistic structure of the cloud marketplace and the market dominance of a mere handful of US and Chinese tech platforms therein. As we make amply clear on the web tool, a big challenge the world faces is to find ways to maximize the myriad benefits associated with the cloud, and to do so in a way that particularly addresses the challenge associated with the handover of most functions from on-premises infrastructure to the cloud, while at the same time minimizing the risks and costs associated with these transitions. These issues are usually discussed in most fora by experts dealing with the US perspective. Today, we have decided to depart from that practice and draw attention to both the European and African perspective as they approach this agenda. To eloquently walk us through their respective perspectives on the governance challenges accompanying the digital transformation from a European and African perspective, we have two outstanding experts with us. One is our very own Nanjira Sambuli, a fellow at our Technology and International Affairs program, but who is based in Nairobi, and Marietta Sharkey, the International Policy Director of the Stanford Center for Policy Center, and previously for a decade, a Dutch MEP from the Liberal Democratic Party. So our plan calls for me to pose to them a few questions for about half an hour, then invite you all to pose questions, which will then address to the panelists. Please be explicit in who you try to address it to, and so on. Finally, each of them will have 2 minutes to offer concluding remarks. So with those as the ground rules, let me turn to Marietta first. Thank you, Marietta, for doing it. Europe has been at the forefront of the efforts to try and regulate the digital transformation early on, initially taking on search engines and bundling of services. A couple of years ago, the GDPR, and more recently, the efforts into the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Service Act, and so on, which are clearly now being translated into actual explicit regulatory language. What are the principles and concerns that fuel Europe's lead role in this effort? And how concerned are you that this lead role that Europe will play will in some way stifle innovation?
Thank you so much, Ellie and Nanjira. Nice to see you. Congratulations to Carnegie on this new mapping of policy issues. I think it's really helpful to focus on what is really at stake here, right? As we see big tech companies getting more powerful, involved in more and more areas, sectors, and parts of our lives, not only within countries, but also spanning borders, so reaching very different contexts where issues of rights protections and competition protection may be very different. So I'm glad you touched on those in your question. When you asked me what are the principles through which European lawmakers, and of course they're spanning a wide political spectrum, but where the majority has their concerns, I would say traditionally the EU has been focused on antitrust and competition in somewhat similar ways as the United States has been. So you could say the principles that they're trying to preserve are fair competition, an open market, and innovation. Because if there's only a couple of big monopolistic actors, it's much harder for smaller companies to ever get a foot in the door. And that is particularly true for the area of cloud computing, where we really see that big players can build on to the big successes, the big investments they can make, the big collections of data that they already have, and sort of build based on size and market share. The other set of principles that the EU has been quite prominent in is the foundations of fundamental rights. So you mentioned the General Data Protection Regulation, first step in this direction of making sure that not only companies, but also governments have clear obligations in how they treat data, keep data, and transfer data, and so on. So those two pillars are now evolving with more legislative packages, as you mentioned. There's a Digital Services Act in the pipeline focusing very much on content moderation, so speech issues. There's an AI Act coming up that looks at risk that comes from the application of artificial intelligence, data governance. A CHIPS Act is coming up to look at supply chains and how to strengthen this vital ingredient for the European market. And I think what has been historically weaker on the European side is national security and the geopolitical dimension of the way that technology shapes not only societies, but also matters of security and competition in that context. So not only economic competition, but also geopolitical competition and military aspects of the use of technology. And so your last part of the question was, do I worry that innovation might be stifled in the EU as a result of regulation? I think this is a sort of sentence or a sort of notion that we hear a lot, right? That regulation stifles innovation. I hear it a lot when I'm in Silicon Valley. And I think it really depends on how we see regulatory efforts filled in. Obviously, there are regulations that can make it harder for some actors to compete, but sometimes that's the intention. When we look at monopolists, the whole idea of regulation is to make sure that they are not the only ones who get a chance at innovating, and that there's also smaller companies that have a chance. There are a lot of people pointing to the fact that big players are disincentivized to innovate just because they're already so comfortable with their market share. And similarly, you could also say that, for example, having clear rules on the preservation of privacy forces companies to innovate with privacy protecting services. So I don't think it's a black and white issue, but I do worry about the lack of European industrial policy and success when it comes to producing tech successes on the basis of those fundamental principles, whether it be in the fundamental rights area or in the antitrust and competition angle. So I'll stop there just to give more room for interaction.
Thank you, Marietta. But just a quick follow-up question. What sets apart Europe and the United States in this realm is that Europe is actually seeking digital sovereignty and strategic autonomy?
Yeah, those are two sentences also that I think are quite fraught, because before Europeans started raising their hands and saying, oh, we want European digital sovereignty now, we heard similar claims from countries like China, like Russia, with a very different background and a very different ambition than what we hear in Europe, because obviously states like China and Russia, as evidenced by their actions every day, are really hoping to bring the tech sector under their direct political control. And I think that's a very different issue from the types of independence or self-sufficiency for which we hear calls, by the way, not only in Europe, but also in the US, with new package investing in infrastructure, including digital infrastructure, with concerns about the fragility of supply chains that can really lead not only to economic disruption, but potentially also to big cybersecurity risks. So the thinking about where does mutual dependence and interconnectivity actually benefit us, and where can it create a new risk, is a thought that I think is top of mind in many parts of the world. But the way in which it is shaped is quite different in Europe than it is elsewhere. I think it's not feasible for Europe to be, completely autonomous. I don't know how they would achieve it, and I also see a lot of merit in closer cooperation on the basis of rules between like-minded countries, but ideally also between countries that are not as like-minded, because it's good to have agreements on the conditions of trade, the conditions of exchanging data, the minimal thresholds to ensure security and rights protections and so on. So I think a rules-based relationship in the mutual dependence that our world knows, not being naive, but also not being believing in illusions when it comes to everyone's own role in that bigger connected ecosystem.
Thank you, Marietta. I would just add that India is also struggling with this digital sovereignty and strategic autonomy, which
Absolutely.
is another huge market. Manjira, for Africa, is looking at it from afar, not that far, but for somewhat afar, it looks like the digital transformation in general and the cloud in particular offer both enormous potential to bring you a lot closer and integrate you more tightly into this revolution, but also some risk and complications. To the extent that you can actually talk about an African approach or African approaches, because there is no kind of one unified approach. What would characterize kind of the concerns, the interests, and the issues that African states are struggling with in this realm?
Thanks, Ali. I think it's if you want to summarize it, would really to say I think with Africa's cloud journey, it's really a manifestation of how political technology is or digitalization is, both the geopolitical aspect and local or regional politics aspects to it. You have a market combined that's about an extra billion plus people with great potential for growth, the opportunity to actually leapfrog where it is context appropriate. And all these interests on one hand do give African governments something to go out there and say, look, come and invest in our infrastructure. But on the sort of global stage as well, you have all these other politics of who will align with whom in terms of the values we want to advance as far as digitalization goes. So you have, for example, the European Union really investing heavily at the continental level with the African Union and sort of trying to set up an African digital single market. And so its investments through member states and through the European Commission are geared towards how you can get a unified African approach, so to speak, that then creates a digital single market and connects Africa to Europe for cross-border data flows. Then you have China or India and the US also coming in with their different interests that are driving why they want to help connect Africa and Africans. And through that, one big question remains then what becomes the African government's positions that reflect the interests of African citizens? And that remains a theater that is one that we must watch. Really, it does seem like it does become a question of what kinds of trade-offs have to be made. Is it seeking first the infrastructural investment and all these other considerations like regulation or competition will be considered after? It's one argument I've heard, for example. Do you take the rights-based approach that Europe has sort of become a world leader in? And then, you very quickly hit the snag of what are rights when there is no infrastructure, right? What are the citizen interests? What are the local innovations that could actually also be contextual? How do those figure in policy decisions? It makes it all a very interesting theater for assessment, and one that's growing more curious by the day. So in some, there isn't really a continental approach. Different countries have different takes on it, but really it seems at the end of the day, for many African governments, it's first, how do we get infrastructure that connects our people, but also serves their local interests, whether it's more democratic or otherwise. And so I imagine in the mind of a policymaker in Africa, there are many balancing interests there. Hopefully it would lead to a vibrant discussion on what's in it for Africans, what makes it possible for us to win. But that's just something we'll have to wait and see if it indeed guides what becomes the eventual ecosystem of cloud.
Thank you, Nanjira. Let me quickly follow up on your presentation of the lay of the land in Africa with two small questions related to this. How much of what we're seeing is actually the impact of government's efforts to develop things in certain direction, e-services or whatever? How much are we seeing the local private sector playing in this realm? Is it comparable to the US and to the local private sector? And then if we're actually talking about external players, how much of it is that the actual suppliers, say China, that is playing a disproportionate role in Africa, digital development, pushing in certain directions, versus, say, the US tech platforms trying to shape the development? So can you try and I know we're putting you on the spot by trying to capitalize what happens across the entire continent, so I apologize. But nevertheless, would you be able to give the audience a little bit of a feel of what are the driving forces behind what we're seeing in Africa?
Sure. And maybe to illustrate, I'll take one country example, Kenya, my country, where you see a bit of everything you've just described playing out. So the private sector, I would say the telecommunications sector, is very interested in continuing to offer innovative services. We have this, it's actually emblematic of a trend now with telco sector players in Africa who are moving from what is called the telecommunications sector to tech co, right? So they're trying to become corporations that go beyond just offering the infrastructure that other players sort of build upon. So in that process, they are adopting to cloud infrastructure really rapidly. Now that then gets them towards who supplies the cloud infrastructure. When the US government was trying to shore up support to sort of ban Huawei, Safaricom, which is the leading telecommunications sector player in Kenya, basically came out and said, well, we have to get the infrastructure anyway. We have no skin in the geopolitical game, so to speak, except to make sure we offer services to people who actually do need them. And so sort of skirted that. And we saw that reflected also in the sort of Kenyan government position on what would happen vis-a-vis Huawei and banning its infrastructure supply. And that's very indicative of what becomes the geopolitics of tech in many African countries. We need the tech. We need the tech. All these other things are, in a sense, it's a trade-off. It's like, those are supplementary issues. We'll figure that out as we go along. At the same time, there are principles that are not necessarily overt, but are implied. So Marita pointed out the minefield that is sovereignty. That's rightfully so. Increasingly, we see that the European version or the Chinese version have this dichotomy. For an African government official, typically they'll listen to both and be like, we want power, obviously, to understand what we want to do, whether it's service provision, whether it's security, national security for that matter, or other concerns. And they listen to both aspects and see what should drive the kind of vendor that they should seek in that sort of geopolitical theater. So there's that vibrancy to it all, where it's driven locally. You have then global tech players who want to offer services much closer to keep us all hooked, so to speak, who are moving closer and investing heavily in the infrastructure. And actually, on that note, it's really worth noting that, especially with US big tech, first they came to Africa with fantastical projects about connecting us via, drones and balloons and these fantastical things that are sort of the stuff of sci-fi. But they realize they have to go back to first principles, and they've all been investing heavily in fiber optic and submarine cables that are now starting to land on the continent. So they're coming in as a formidable power or counterpower to the China infrastructure player level. And so for the Africans, at the end of the day, what is sovereignty when you're not even you're not creating your own infrastructure? It will mean something markedly different. And I think it's going to be fragmented insofar as how that ends up in terms of services that governments provide to the citizens, but also the sort of competitive market environment that is created by the kinds of infrastructure that have been made available. So any way you look at it, there's a fascinating perspective that Africa has to offer to this conversation.
Thank you. Marietta, we made it look by creating the comparison between Africa and Europe as if Europe is kind of a cohesive entity, which in some ways it is, but we're also seeing considerable divergence in, say, Hungary and Poland versus more Western parts of Europe in terms of digital space, the role of the government, the freedom of speech, the rule of law. We can go and how does that play out in the ability of Europe, and particularly the EU, to develop a coherent, cohesive, forward-leaning agenda of the nature that we've been trying to develop and promote?
Well, you're absolutely right that any erosion of respect for the rule of law, I think, is problematic, and it lowers the credibility and the ability of the EU as a whole to act credibly and to act effectively. Now, I do think there's one big difference between foreign policy areas where member states have a veto and most of the more economic policies where that is not as much the case. So when you look at the EU policies for the moment, they are very much driven by, I would say, higher ambitions that are not hindered, thankfully, by vetoes from a country like Hungary, which indeed is going proudly, unfortunately, into a illiberal direction, right? We saw a little bit of muted response from Viktor Orban leading up to the elections, also in response to the devastating war that Vladimir Putin has started in Ukraine. But now that the victory is his, he is, more self-assured as ever and siding rather with the Putins of this world than with the leaders in Brussels, which is, of course, very sad and also speaks to many painful lessons to be learned about, letting that go on and fester for too long. But it brings me to what I picked up from what Nanjira said as well, which is really how important context is where technologies are used. Let me give you one example, and it's also interesting for you, Ellie, because it's about the Israeli hacking software that a company like NSO Group makes. There you see that the EU, and I worked on this policy, it took forever, but finally there were some restrictions in place to make sure that these types of technologies that could be very harmful for human rights when used in a context where people don't enjoy any protections could not be exported from the EU. But thanks to investigative journalists, we've learned that countries like Hungary and Orban's government have imported these technologies from Israeli firms, for example. And the link I see with the whole question that is playing out in African countries at the moment is, of course, not only can the right infrastructure be attracted, can the right innovations and development be realized, but also what context, when it comes to rights protections, do these technologies get imported into? Because for the longest time, and Kenya is a good example of that, a lot of countries did not have a data protection law, even if very sophisticated technologies were being used, and often to the detriment of the people who forget about whether your rights are respected. There's no rights to claim if there's not a law in place, which can be very problematic. And so I think what we're missing sometimes in this whole question of, countries, especially developing countries, seeking to rush ahead, to leapfrog, to make sure that the most innovative services are available to their people and all the job opportunities that are hoped for, that we do not overlook the fact that in a different context, a service or product may play out very differently and often, I would say, more harmfully for people. And that is something that unfortunately happens everywhere. You mentioned India before, where there were high hopes of what levels of democratic alliance could be achieved with the country, but where rights violations are really rampant at the same time. So I would like to urge everybody, when they think about the role of technology, to also be specific about how it unpacks if you look at the different aspects and not just at the technology itself, for example.
So I not only welcome your remarks, we can discuss the Israeli experience separately, but what I would actually like to draw you out, both of you, and start with Nanjira. We're talking here about some of the values that undergird the digital technology in general, in the cloud, whether it's on enterprise protection and so on. But one area that we haven't discussed thus far are the values pertaining to sustainability and inclusiveness, which may be a particularly acute issue in Africa. So Nanjira, would you be kind enough to shed some light on how, on the one hand, wants to take things forward, and even if we put aside for a second, just for a second, the issues Marietta has talked about protection of the individuals and so on from abuses and so on, how is that development taking place with sustainability? How much sustainability and inclusiveness is actually baked in, particularly in light of tribal conflicts, regional conflicts, and so on, as of the nature we're seeing in Ethiopia, for example, now.
Yeah, that's valid. And it does emphasize what Marita was saying about the environment within which all these technologies, while we view them in a very technical lens, are play out is varied. I would say what would underpin what becomes sustainability and inclusion for many fraught contexts is the resilience. So we see that sustainable infrastructure is increasingly mobile infrastructure because there are communities that are nomadic for a number of reasons, including climate change. So they need to have that kind of infrastructure that does move around with them. And that's a nuance that really does need to be brought into how we talk about both mobile infrastructure in Africa and sustainability. We see it in energy access, which is a determinant, of course, of cloud and other infrastructure. The clean energy resources are there, but it's still very expensive to then power much of digital infrastructure through it because of different politics playing out in that domain. So what does sustainability look like in that becomes a really interesting trade-off. We've seen up until recently some African countries were actually considering just drawing out the coal from the land because that is a more established system, if you will, of energy production, right? Regardless of the natural, green, clean resources that they have. So those are politics that then compound with the politics of technology to complicate what we call sustainability. So while we have sustainability, a la the sustainable development goals, you have this real politic of, is it mobile? Is it something people can pick up and move around with? Is it something that then can also be adaptable? Because as more and more people come onto the infrastructure, there are demands, for more capacity, for example. Those become aspects of it. Inclusion becomes particularly interesting too, because that would be, in a sense, the entire goal. It is actually including a lot of people who have not been included in infrastructure. I mean, for some people, access to digital services is in many ways the first time they're accessing services, be they from government, be they from ease of money, remittance, or any other service that has been revolutionized or transformed by digitalization. So that becomes interesting, but it does have its nuances around how which societies are favored or seen through the governmental or governance regimes in different places, which ones are being suppressed in terms of the kinds of resources they're able to access. So it has that at once technical and political aspect. So usually my urge to most people who are trying to analyze what's happening in Africa is to always pair the technological with the political, and understand that at best start from a principle of it's complicated with every value that we want to put out there, the trade-offs that will essentially be made, but most importantly also what we can learn overall from a region that's coming at this from a different plane than the others in the West.
Thank you. So one final question before we try to have questions from the audience. Marietta, is the fact that the technology is at the end of the day married with values, does that actually mean that for Europe, for example, you would find the market shut out for Chinese companies, Chinese tech platforms? How far would the principles that you're talking about make it either practically impossible or very difficult for the Chinese tech platforms that at home operate by very different principles to actually offer their services on the continent?
Yeah, so I think the answer there would be that European legislation is aimed at being sort of, I wouldn't say neutral, but it's not geographically biased in that sense. So, for example, the need to protect people's privacy would be equally applying to American companies with all the trouble that brings along, as it would to Chinese companies. So, if you contrast it with the atmosphere in the United States, in the US, there's a real sort of shared concern about a lot of security risks, but also rights risks and competition risks that come with Chinese technology. It's probably the only thing that Democrats and Republicans agree on. And that type of concern around the rise of China is not seen in Europe the same way. And I think sometimes people are too naive. Price can still play a big role, and it's been a success for the Chinese leaders to play European countries apart. There is such a thing as 17+1, which is sort of like a sub group of countries, including many EU member states, that engage with Beijing instead of saying we only engage with Beijing as one bloc, the European Union. So I think there's a lot of maturing that needs to happen on the part of Europe. And one of the reasons is, and that is maybe something that is not always seen from the outside, is that decisions about national security in the European Union are made on the member state level. And so that means we have 27 different readings of what risk looks like, or what the benefits and the costs are of bringing in cheaper Chinese network technologies, just to stick with the theme of the question. And the friction between the national security aspects and the market aspects, the ambition to have one single European market, that was also mentioned as almost a model that the African Union might look to. The idea to really have a level playing field, to have similar laws and their applications across the entire continent is one that's being worked on. It's very important. It's a foundation of the European Union as a whole. Whereas on the other hand, matters of national security are decided 27 different times. And the problem is, of course, when we look at digital, is that there is such a new and intense integration of rights aspects, economic aspects, and security aspects. It's often quite difficult to untangle. And so it becomes almost a mismatch in the policy sense to look at how the EU is currently organized, what mandates are at the European level, which ones are at the member state level, and how they relate to the new realities that new technologies bring. And I think the whole aspect that you touched upon with Nanjira about sustainability, the pressure on the environment, right? Natural resources, energy use, water use, and so on, particularly of data centers, is another aspect that is just not thought through enough. And this is particularly relevant for the relation between national governments and local governments in this sense. So it's not even the central European level, not even the national level, but also the local level, where there are just many different mandates of who gets to decide on what. And at the end of the day, there's a big question, does it all add up? So I'll give you one example. There's a province here where I'm sitting now in the Netherlands. It's called Noord-Holland. It's about the size of Rhode Island, the US state of Rhode Island. In other words, it's not very big. And this province has 57 data centers. And I'm sure, knowing Dutch bureaucracy, that all the proposals and the licensing applications and the procedures have been walked through diligently and have been rubber stamped at the right desk. But who keeps control of whether this all adds up, whether it is desirable to have 57 data centers using water, using wind, using other, land, agricultural land in a small country, and so on and so forth. And so the question of who decides on what related to technology, and does that governance structure, that authority and that oversight match the reality and also the cleverness, frankly, of a lot of these companies that are, often succeeding best in finding where the gaps lie between jurisdictions and so on, is, I think, a big question that we can apply to anything from sustainability questions to rights protection questions to national security questions and economic development questions. It may be time to really look at how digitization impacts the policy landscape, and not just to take the policy avenues that we've known for so long and try to extend them onto the new digital reality. It's often mismatching, I find.
Yes, I think we are all in agreement, and just to say, we try to cover that in our web tool, but all this confluence of issues that you were talking about here, but the thing that you're mentioning is the difficulty of indeed reconciling those various interests in terms of both values as well as the institutions that are supposed to perform that role, as you've been, even in an orderly country like the Netherlands. So it's quite clear. Is there Nanjira, is there an African effort to try and create any kind of a coherent framework, the way Europe is aiming for and the way the US has struggled to and thus far has been unable to? I'm asking you in particular because when one reads, for example, the statement from the recent Africa-China summit, it looked like there was one coherent viewpoint. China is 80% of the digital infrastructure in Africa, will continue to be the leader player, and so on. There will be development would be the number one issue, and so on. All of the other issues would be kind of secondary in place. How should we understand where Africa is going in that respect? You talked about Kenya and so on. Everyone is some people are talking about, Senegal as an example, Egypt, and so on. Can you shed a little bit of light on tech for us? Is there an African vision?
There might be a political one, and I think with the heads of states and all these Africa Plus One summits, there is increasingly a convergence on the positions they'll have. So comparing the China Africa and the European Europe Africa summit that just happened not too long ago, you see the very political alignment in terms of positions, statements, and so on and so forth. So that the China's proposal for digital transformation, I think, was met with more excitement and alignment than, say, the European approach or proposal through the global gateway. But that is the political consensus, so to speak. It does not necessarily translate to the infrastructure, the institutional aspects of legislation and regulation. And, the one big attempt by the African Union at the continental level with member states to have a sort of regional continental-wide legislation was the African Union Convention on Cybersecurity and Data Protection, the Malabo Convention, that sailed through the processes of the African Union. Member states politically indicated that they would ratify it, and to date it is yet to come into law because it has not reached the minimum number of member states, including my country Kenya, who ought to have ratified it to become the law of the land vis-a-vis cybersecurity and data protection. So every country has sort of seen that it's one thing to signal politically, and then they're like, we'll go back home and we'll figure out what works for us. So that even Kenya's road to its data protection regulation or act right now, the process that was done locally versus the process that was ratified politically are markedly different. So we're sort of caught up in course correcting that. Something as simple as we have the act, yes, and so that is almost like a compliance checkbox, right? If you want to attract an Amazon or a big company. But it also has mechanisms such as the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner being housed under a Ministry of ICT, so still under the thumb of the political actor, so to speak. So it also does call for how we analyze what are the tick boxes. Is it a law? Is it regulations? Is it an Office of a Data Protection Commissioner? Reading through the substance is really, really important for us to understand how complicated it is to say, is there going to be a position at African level or even at regional level? So you have stronger regional economic actors like ECOWAS in the West Africa region. What they would be able to do at that regional level or the East African or Southern African counterparts is markedly different from what will be signaled at the African Union level. So it does call for a humble approach to how we inquire about what's happening, because it's not the absence of these things that's even more that says there's nothing happening. It's also in the signals that are being sent out, maybe to obfuscate what will really happen in the end. And we need to have the latitude to actually follow those and just take them for what they are and what they may be signaling is coming.
Thank you. Marietta, let me go back to you and ask you something that you have alluded to. When you're dealing with the national security agenda on the one hand and the other types of values or interests that one is trying to promote and imbue in the digital the infrastructure development and the markets. To what extent the experience of a recent specific small European state with Chinese sanctions, as well as the Ukraine saga, the tragedy that has unfolded, to what extent this has shifted the outlook towards a common Euro-Atlantic vision on the one hand, or Europe has to be self-sufficient and or more autonomous in this respect? I think the pandemic has already created some seeds of tension. How much do we have to look after ourselves when it comes to masks and vaccines and things of that nature? But clearly amplified with these two recent examples. So where are we in this balancing between the national security agenda and the others?
Oh, it's such a rich question. So I think there's a wide understanding that even if ambitions might be different, the EU still very much depends on the transatlantic security umbrella for almost everything. On the other hand, I think a lot of Europeans are quite convinced that a rights-based approach, a democratic approach to placing technology within our societies, not outside of them, is very important. So I see hope among European legislators and policymakers that in the United States, there may also be a realization now after the Trump years, which were considered quite dark for a lot of people. There is now momentum with the Biden administration to focus on preserving democracy. And I think this is where the national security question, the need to work together across democratic nations to preserve that critical mass vis-a-vis, rising authoritarian tendencies, whether it's within or our societies or globally, needs work. That perhaps we've taken democracy for granted too much. And I think the awareness is there in the United States, but maybe more juxtaposed vis-a-vis an authoritarian China. And the awareness is there in Europe, clearly, with very sad and vivid, recollection of how important it is, because we no longer have peace in Europe today. So, without peace, democracy is very difficult to aspire to. So the war is a reminder, but also the whole question of how technology plays a role is something that the EU has just focused on much more, and where I think Europeans are hoping that they can bring the Americans on board. And I actually think that it's going to be a matter of sort of, adding up and dividing by two, meaning the Europeans could do well with some more realistic views on the geopolitical realities of technology that are more prominent in the US. The Americans could do well with a better appreciation for which rights concerns, democracy concerns are really at stake with the role that technology plays in our society. So, maybe if we put it together, give it a good shake, and then divide it by two, there could be some, compromise to be found, which I do think we can see contours of in the Trade and Technology Council that is dealing with a number of these issues across the Atlantic, but which you can also see, I thought, remarkably in the responses back and forth between the US and the EU in the responses to the announcements of CHIPS Acts. So new efforts to deal with those supply chain challenges that I briefly mentioned in the beginning of this session, where the US came out and welcomed the EU's announcement for CHIPS Act. Completely different response than we saw with the Digital Markets Act, for example, where Commerce Secretary Raimondo was still coming out and saying this is unfairly targeting American companies and so on and so forth. So maybe you're right that the context of the war in Russia or by Russia in Ukraine, the high stakes of this geopolitical momentum could lead to better democratic alignment. And I think Europe very much looks to the African continent for alliances and a new type of relation in light of this, geopolitical momentum too, could lead to stronger democratic alignment. If you ask me, should lead to stronger democratic alignment. But it's a very delicate balance. It's a very delicate balance. And I really hope that the need to preserve democracy and the rule of law can prevail, because there are so many other pushing and pulling factors of shorter term concern, perhaps, or of political battles. As Nanjira rightly mentioned, all of this is very much political. And so I think we are finding ourselves at a very crucial moment for the future of democracy. And I hope that the wake-up calls that some people might have needed have been dealt to them by the most unfortunate reality of the fragility of democracy that we see everywhere.
I think that your hopes are somewhat pinned on the outcome of the U.S.
I think we lost you, Ellie. At least you're frozen on my side.
Mine too. Oh, the clouds.
Right.
Oh, we lost you for a second. A pinned on a certain political outcome in the United States in the coming 2-3 years that would reinforce the current Euro-US, with ties in the direction you mentioned, or bring it back 2 or 3 years to different times.
Well, I think you're absolutely right, but I would frame it a little bit differently. So obviously a lot relates to how American politics will shape up this year and in 2 years. But I think for Europeans, the realization that we cannot sort of count on the US to be firmly on the democratic side, to be firmly a part of NATO and the transatlantic alliance has hit home. It has hit home. And I think actually concerns about what might happen if another, less multilateralist, less democratic with a small d president gets elected, has actually led to a lot of jumping into action on the European side. Perhaps late, but it certainly is a perspective that is leading over here, I would say. And so it's a double-edged sword, right? On the one hand, there's hope that the transatlantic relation can be reinvigorated and strengthened for the future. On the other hand, there's a realistic sense of how fragile this momentum in American politics might be, how short-lived it might be. And so that there needs to be preparation for a changing world. Much the same, I would say, as how the US has very much invested in the Indo-Pacific, acknowledging that the world has changed. And so everybody's making their own calculations based on how they think geopolitics will evolve and how they can best protect their own values and interests.
Thank you. So Nanjira, when you have now the EU coming with its own digital agenda for Africa, the US is trying to provide a counter for BRI on its part and on the digital space. And the Chinese are doubling down on trying to be kind of at the forefront of the edge that they have created in Africa and so on. What do you really see happening? You're sort of, is Africa going to be cherry picking and taking a little bit of each, playing them off one against the other? Or will we get some kind of more alignment precisely on the values and rights and so on agenda going forward? What's your hunch? Asking you an easy question.
I'd summarize it in a sense as a diplomatic saying of sort of Africa will look neither east nor west, it will look forward. Now, what forward means for Africa is its own conversation, obviously. It might entail a bit of that cherry picking. It might entail what's convenient for whatever regime is in any particular country in power. But I think, because we've danced around what it means technology governance in the with respect to democracy, with respect to human rights, those as value propositions are up for debate within the continent itself. An African government could argue that providing economic opportunities, regardless of how they get to it, is a democratic act or is a human rights aspect. Now, are you going to tell them it should be the Western style or the Eastern style? And they'll ask you, so who are you to say that's the best way to go about it? So it's really called for getting Europeans and Americans really to understand that it's not about playing the way China has, which is really not using those terms in a sort of like value judgment, value assigning role, but to see it from the realpolitik aspect an African government will be coming at it from. And, figuring out, is democracy an end product or is it something that must be rubber stamped by the existence of something, saying it, waxing lyrical about it or something? I think it really does go back to even just defining what democracy means. Beyond how it's played out in the West. Somebody mentioned that, there's language now about renorming democracy coming from China and Russia, that I think rather than react to and say it's illegitimate, is worth listening to. I think just to understand how other people are coming at the end goal, prosperity for their people, a stake in the game of being connected and being in a globalized world, what they have to offer and what they want. If we de-escalate sometimes, I think from some of these terminologies, not to say that we do not look out for democracy, obviously, might help us get towards a better way of understanding what's best for each region. Because I think the way we are going now with the it's great to see the transatlantic alliance. It could risk sort of alienating everybody else. And then you could have this alienated majority who then come up with their own counter. And they are, in terms of numbers, much bigger markets, right? And that's even beyond the scope of technology, but really in how conversations about the future of multilateralism, the future of the global order are shaping up. I would not blame an African government for saying, hey, y'all can talk about democracy and human rights till kingdom come. I have mouths to feed. I have people who must not cross, to the oceans, climate realities, conflicts that have, aggravated for a number of reasons. Those are my primary issues. And I will work with them towards them through the tools that are most convenient convenient to de-escalate, to actually offer people economic opportunities alongside the political and civic ones.
So just as a quick follow-up, Nanjira, the Chinese are coming forward, offering state-of-the-art technology, generous funding, slightly less generous than they offered, but generous funding, less transparency, which some African governments find quite attractive in the contracting. And in many ways, the technology is also more affordable. And that was one of the challenges that, for example, were to try and offer an alternative to Huawei, or there were not even major players who were able to provide the equipment quickly and so on. So with those type of advantages, do you see any way of checking that Chinese appeal, or is it likely to be we have to reconcile ourselves that this would be a very important player in the continent going forward? And now the question would be maybe on a state-by-state basis, how do you bake it with the kind of values that you are subscribed to, Marietta subscribed to, and so on?
I think that's where the West's strengths in market economics would come in. If you're able to offer something that is not just about rights, but it's also about the cost efficiencies for these governments in terms of procurement, or better deals in terms of whatever it takes to actually connect people, I think that would create another avenue to have more nuanced conversations about how you also do that while having it become rights respecting, while also embedding what we are calling democratic values. But just sort of harping on about how we need you to stop because this is a bad actor, it's something that would not even fly with even a junior officer anymore. It's like we've been listening to this for the last 50 years, predating the digital. Why would we start listening to that now when all this human rights aspect has not necessarily led to better outcomes, right? And it's it really is an unfortunate position that we should find ourselves in, because it also makes it look like, seeking out rights and democratic realities for people is, in a sense, saying you remain backward. And that's what it's come to mean. So that it means that how we reload that conversation, almost like deconstruct it to reconstruct it, has to look at what is happening across the continent right now and figure out how else, what are the other sort of terms we can use, what are the other frames we can use beyond technology and human rights, or rather democracy and human rights, so that at some point we don't also end up at a point where we cannot have those conversations on the continent because nobody wants to hear them, not the governments, not the citizens, unfortunately, or even the market players there in the private sector or the local private sector. So, I mean, that's where we are going as far as real politics goes. And I do not want to live in an Africa that says, we're not even going to have any conversation about rights because what are rights when there's no food to eat, or that kind of false dichotomy. So we have to be very aware of that in conversations on the West, that we could increasingly be pushing decisions made off of false dichotomies, which would ultimately hurt Africans.
Thank you.
Maybe I have a question. Sorry.
Go ahead.
No, because I'm really fascinated by that. And the times that I was able to travel to African countries, it became even more clear to me how the legacy of colonialism is obviously still a scar that influences how people view the role of the European Union in particular, and in particular then again some member states and their motives. I just wonder whether you think a moment might come where that same kind of dynamic is perceived as having come from China, and whether when that realization, because I've seen it in some countries, right, where quick investments and the types of relatively affordable loans without questions asked, let's not talk about democracy, let's not talk about human rights, in fact, let's rather not talk about them, actually catch up with countries, because it turns out that the infrastructure was poor, or the conditions for the loans were terrible in the medium to long term, or that new expectations are raised in a similar way that these countries have fought so hard to break free from. But that may, unfortunately, serve the political elites. And I think that that's where there's, for me at least, a question that I'll be following with great interest. Might we expect African countries to come to the conclusion that the type of relationship that China might be seeking with its modern day tech-driven development can lead to the same kind of dynamics that they've wanted to shake off when it came to the relation with Western countries?
And I mean, in some cases, already is a conversation, even before we look at it in terms of digital infrastructure, which I guess we haven't yet seen. But, with analog infrastructure, those questions are already coming up. What kind of deal is this we've gotten ourselves into? And I think the question of whether China is an agent of digital colonialism is sort of met with that. Yeah, they are. But it's almost like you choose how the contours, in a sense. It's almost like it comes with its own agency, which is a weird thing to say. I guess when you have two bad deals to pick, you'll try and figure out which is the less bad deal. But that is the reality that a continent like Africa finds itself, and arguably, parts of Latin America too. And the frames of analysis just have to come from that point. It's not just about value judgments and assignments and theories. It really is about on that ground, in that situation, what does that actually mean? And in digital, again, most of the devices the end user is using have been designed by Chinese in a way that is very responsive to the needs of a continent. I mean, a phone that can actually retain battery charge for 2 days is a welcome gadget if you're not having ready access to electricity when you're on the move. So that it balances the sort of the good and the bad in that sense. And so that's the same thing I would say Western offerings should be. For every talk about democracy, it also has to be about what kinds of platforms. And I would say, we see this with social media, where those platforms have been instrumental in helping people further exercise the freedom of expression in their respective, countries and so on and so forth. So what does that mean about how you get the Western arsenal to also make sure that it ramps up the good offerings in that way? That then, at the end of the day, we figure out how it balances out for the for continent's citizens. But it's just going to take a lot more than where we are in our conversations, to be honest.
Yeah, and I think the real question is what could be the sort of hidden risks from using social media? Free expression, yes, but what about the collection of data, and how can it be abused against people, disinformation around elections, and so on? The same with infrastructure. I mean, Europeans don't really have social media companies to offer, but they've invested in mobile technology networks and so on, through the telecoms operators. And then the question is, can those be abused for mass surveillance or for, keeping tabs on people in different ways, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I see we've been asked a question about African leaders being concerned about Chinese surveillance, and I can only answer that anecdotally because we don't know for sure with this particular example what really happened. But the Chinese did gift the African Union a swanky building. And the story goes that later on in some sort of security inspection, it was found to be heavily bugged. So the entire infrastructure around which the union's institutions were connected was sending data back to China. That so goes the story. The fact that the relations remain the way they are, however that was negotiated or addressed, I would say I think African governments do expect that, obviously, but go into that kind of arrangement knowing full well the kind of partner they're negotiating with on the other side and what they're capable of. And to be honest, many of them might kind of desire to have the same digital ecosystem that exists in China, because power is exactly the end game for many actors. So it's not just they're clutching pearls, they're afraid, they see it, and they also are maybe aspiring towards it. And it's not just African governments alone, I would argue. So again, the long and short of it is, it's complicated.
Well, thank you. 30 seconds with concluding thoughts from either of you. I wanted to draw you out on content moderation, but I guess we'll have to wait for the next round. But 30 seconds concluding thoughts. Marietta?
Well, what I take away from this very wide-ranging and dynamic discussion is how important not only the specific characteristics of business models and technologies are, but also the context within which they're going to be used. And the context can change because of war, because of an election of a new president, because of incidents, but also because of perpetual inequalities, lack of rights protections on the ground, or geopolitical tensions. So I hope that when people think about tech governance, when Carnegie proceeds with its important work, those two elements will really be brought together in the dynamic way that they are evolving, so that people can make better choices about what kind of societies and leadership and world essentially they want and what the role for technology is in it.
Thank you. Final thought?
I'd say,
Nanjira?
yeah, sure. Africa's back end infrastructure may be predominantly Chinese, but the front end infrastructure is predominantly Western and local. And so afford Africa that nuance when you think about what comes next. And I promise it will be interesting.
Thank you both for brilliant remarks. We look forward to collaborating in the future. And I wish our audience a wonderful evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ellie. Have a nice day, everyone.
Thank you.